Oli here, and this is my review of Battlefield, the first story of the 26th season of classic Doctor Who, starring Sylvester McCoy as the 7th Doctor. Battlefield is 156th overall, it's 4 parts long, and it's written by Ben Aronovich. So, we're now on the final season of classic Doctor Who. It's been a wild journey, and the finish line is just a few feet ahead. So, the plot of Battlefield is as follows. Responding to a distress signal, the Doctor and Ace arrive near the village of Carberry, where a nuclear missile convoy has run into difficulties. The peace of the English countryside is shattered as unit troops are besieged by armored knights from another dimension. As the crisis deepens, Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart is called out of retirement to join the battle. Together, he and the Doctor must face the Destroyer, a fearsome demon summoned by the Witch Queen Morgaine to devour the world. So that is the plot of Battlefield. Battlefield, in my opinion, is an incredible story, and it's one of my favourite Sylvester McCoy stories as well, and I love how creative Doctor Who was, especially in the last 2 seasons, and it proves that there is a lot of life left in the show, but the BBC didn't really want to admit that. The production was really good, and I loved how the story utilised the location filming, and I loved how some of the sets looked quite modern in this not so modern day future type story that this was, because it was actually set in at least a few years in the future, so it's more of a contemporary future story. Okay? And I really like the pub slash B&B that Liz and her husband Pat ran. I'm not sure if it was an actual set or they used an actual B&B pub for this story, but it's nice to see like something like a pub in Doctor Who, and of course this Battlefield is the last time where we see the TARDIS interior or the Doctor's TARDIS interior in the classic series. But it was actually quite different compared to the usual set because I think it was accidentally destroyed after the making of The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. So, and because the script featured the TARDIS scene, they had to, I think the set designer pretty much had to create a makeshift TARDIS from scratch, and they had to, and I think there was, and they had to, and because it was last minute, they had to have like a dark set, so hence the dimmed lights in the TARDIS in the start when the Doctor and Ace were answering to the distress signal. One set that I really liked was the underwater ship or grave that King Arthur was laid to rest. And this is where the part 2 cliffhanger happened, and this is where Sophie Aldred actually almost died. And the cliffhanger entailed Ace getting trapped in this chamber with water filling up, while the Doctor was getting attacked by some snake creature thing, and obviously Ace was like banging on the glass, and obviously the water was starting to fill up, and that's how the cliffhanger happened. But then, whilst they were filming, I think one of the takes, and it's actually on the special feature on the Battlefield DVD. I'm not sure if it's on the collection Blu-ray disc, but I'm sure it's there. And then, but I think Sophie Aldred was banging on the glass, and I think she didn't really notice that. I think she did notice, but then I think the glass was starting to bend outwards towards the set, and Sylvester McCoy actually noticed this as well. And I'm not sure and obviously he was still in character, and he needed to try and find a way to try and get their attention, because if the glass had shattered and obviously there was electricals all over the place, Sophie would have actually died, and or something else could have happened. So he pretty much had to swear. He had to say, "Shit, the glass is breaking. Get her out of there," in order to quickly get the set producer out. In order to get Aldred out of the water. Luckily, that actually worked. The special effects was quite poor, and I think Ben Aronovich didn't really like that, and it's very hard not to see why, because it did look very cheap and very tacky in some places, especially I think when the castle exploded in part 4, that it was just very poor. But then the 2008 the special edition that was released on the DVD actually does fix this issue, and I do believe that this is one of the first instances where lighter curse words were actually mentioned, like hell, for example. And the direction by Michael Kerrigan was really good, and I think this is probably one of the best stories he's directed for Doctor Who, and I really like how he was able to capture Ben Aronovich's vision for this story, and what the story entailed, with good hints towards the Doctor's mysterious storyline with some good humor as well, and obviously the script helped back the story up. quite well. It was really good, and I really like how Battlefield pretty much is Doctor Who does The Legend of King Arthur. Even though it's taken them 26 years to do this, but as I said, better late than never. And of course, the Brigadier is back, and we haven't seen the Brig since the Five Doctors, and it's always good to see the Brigadier back, and Unit is also back as well, and I think this is the first proper Unit story since... Well, they actually, I think Unit did appear in, I think, the Seeds of Doom at the end of Season 13, but this is the first story where Unit is properly integrated into the plot, and which is just as great, even though the likes of Sergeant Benton and Mike Yates aren't actually there. But Benton was actually mentioned, but it's always good to see Unit back in full force. I liked how the Doctor was actually called Merlin by other characters, not from the time period of this story. Although the Doctor did seem a bit confused himself, but he pretty much just ran with it because Ansling, when he was describing Merlin to the Doctor, he said that Merlin, the Doctor, rides a ship in time, changes his appearances and whatnot, and it does also add that to that element of mystery that the Doctor has, which is something Cartman wanted to achieve. And it seemed that the Doctor had encountered Morgaine before, although their last encounter could have been in the Doctor's future, which and is actually very interesting, because the Doctor actually did leave behind clues for himself to find. And I did like how it was explained that all the people associated with King Arthur slash Morgaine slash Merlin were from an alternate parallel Earth as opposed to being brought forward in time, which does help in not outright saying that the legend of King Arthur and Excalibur happened in the past or referring to it as a myth. Adding to that, I also like how Battlefield doesn't really fall into that trap of pretty much just writing everything off as alien by having Morgaine as some alien queen from a distant future planet who came to Earth and her powers were assumed to be witchcraft or something like that. At all, not because of alien technology or whatnot. It's all and it's seemingly done with magic and allowing for some elements of fantasy to be interwoven with the story. And I think this is definitely something that did aid the Andrew Cartman era, but not having things dive into the sci-fi elements too much, but then there was a healthy balance in between the sci-fi elements and the fantasy elements as well. And then obviously, I think in the past, more notably in the Demons, where the Doctor pretty much had to explain everything off as alien instead of just usual witchcraft or whatnot. In addition, I do like how the story reflects modern day Britain at the time, especially with women as unit soldiers and especially Brigadier Bambera, who is obviously, as what it says in the tin, she's taken over the Brigadier position, and even on English unit stuff, because in the stories and in the previous unit stories, especially in the Third Doctor era, every unit soldier was British, even though it was called United Nations. And then, of course, Dick Brezhnev was actually telling Bambera about the Doctor, and Brigadier Bambera herself is black. And I always say that there's a small this theme of, or at least a small encouragement of women empowerment and how women can prove that they're on par with the men, and even more so of writing the usual standards of men being in charge of everything. And this theme is also added with people who tend to struggle with this as well, like the Brigadier. Like, he's an older gentleman, even though sometimes he kind of come across as a bit blunt and a bit chauvinistic, but then he obviously does it as a way of like making sure that women don't get too involved or too injured in some way, shape, or form. But he's actually struggling to deal with a bit of these changes. And when he's told about Bambera, he refers to Bambera as a he, not knowing that Bambera was actually a woman. And what actually makes it even funnier is that the unit squaddies were actually calling Bambera Sir, which she didn't want to be called Mom all the time, and I think someone calls her Mom, which she strongly disliked, which also adds to the little theme of women being on the same bar as the men. And I think it's also this is also strengthens this at the end when everything is all when the day is saved and Ace, Shoyong, Bambera, and the Brigadier's wife all go off for a night out, and they pretty much ask the men to pretty much do the housework, and the Brigadier was like, what's going to be for dinner, and Doris is like, you can sort out your stuff, and that was a funny scene as well. And I also liked how Battlefield got dark in some parts of the story, such as, and I think this is the first instance where Ace's past was explicitly mentioned, especially when Shu Yong was taunting her for having her parents hating her because and Ace calling Young some racist slurs in return. But this was but obviously they weren't themselves, and they were inside this magic chalk circle that was influencing their behavior, playing mind games against them. In addition, Morgaine herself was pretty much was going to allow her son Mordred to die in order to call the Doctor and the Brigadier's bluff in them wanting to kill Mordred. And which Mordred himself does realize, and I like the foreshadowing with Morgaine and the Doctor playing chess, with the logic behind the game of chess actually does play into the Seventh Doctor's character, and the Doctor outright says, "I'm not playing chess. He's playing poker," and it hints that the Doctor's willing to do anything and is willing to call in any shots whatsoever for his own gain, whether it's to save the day or whether it's to for its own manipulative gain. But there was some good elements of humor in the story, and I think this is one of the stories that actually handles comedy the best and handles the dramatic aspects just as good as well. I think one of my favorite scenes was when Ace was ordering some drinks and they totaled to £5, which seemed shocking because there might have been some inflation compared to Ace's time because I think she was trying to order vodka lemonade or something, or with a glass of water. I think it was it was two lemonade or vodka lemons or something, and it cost £5. And if something like that costs £5 nowadays, I'll fucking take it because I think something like that now probably cost like 10 quid in spoons or something. And thing also like the recurring gag of Ace not knowing how to time, not failing to correctly predict the time that her Nitro 9 explosives will go off, and this is something that happens in Remembrance of the Daleks, and the Doctor actually has to tell Ace to remind him to teach her a lesson about safety and timing and all that. And obviously, Ace, Anselin, and Bambera are pretty much put together for most of the story as a form of as like a romantic side plot. Even though when the two met each other the first time, the two decided to pretty much fight each other. I think this might have been Anselin's way of saying that he likes her. But they were a very funny pair, and I think the expanded media actually mentions that they got married. So yeah, the scenes they were together were quite funny in a good way, and I think it just proves that they were a good duo. And then I think if Doctor Who had returned after this season, I think it would be nice to see them together, and imagine them being together if there were more unit stories set on Earth. There were some very great moments in the story as well, and I think the cliffhangers were quite good, especially part 2's the cliffhanger, which I explained before, with the Doctor and Ace being trapped in their own situation, with the Doctor getting attacked by this stick creature, and Ace was trapped in that glass with that chamber with the water filling up, which ended up almost killing Sophie Aldred. But part 3's cliffhanger definitely deserves a special mention, and this is when Morgaine realizes that she can't harm Ace and Young in the magic circle whilst they were guarding Excalibur, but the Destroyer, who we see for the first time, apparently can, and Morgaine threatens them by saying that he'll break the circle and he'll pretty much take the two girls and make them his own personal handmaidens in hell, and she literally says this word for word. That was very chilling, even for Doctor Who in the 80s, and that scene would honestly give some of the gothic stories in the Hinchcliffe era a run for its money. But then obviously, nothing really happens for a while afterwards because the Destroyer was bound in chains and it was pretty much hindering him from doing anything. But then I think they just eventually gave her the Excalibur. I also like the scene when the Doctor reunites with Bessie, his old car, who we have not seen since the Five Doctors, and Bessie is pimped out as well, especially in terms of having her speed adjusted. The various battle scenes were quite good, especially in Part 4, and I think Part 4 is probably the best of all Battlefield, and it honestly has its moments that should pretty much make the BBC feel bad for cancelling Doctor Who. One of the moments that really made Battlefield stand out was the Brigadier actually destroying the destroyer with a single silver bullet, and the scene where the Doctor finds him afterwards, thinking that he died, even though the Brigadier was actually knocked unconscious by the blast. That was a scene that was brilliantly written and very well acted between McCoy and Nick Courtney as well. And of course, the scene where also makes the story stand out, especially part four, is the Doctor defeating by Morgaine and stopping her plans by telling her what would happen if she allowed the nuclear missiles to launch. Though the speech was actually longer than intended on TV because it was actually cut down for its length. And finally, the ending was actually very fitting of the story, with Ace, Bambera, Doris, and Shoryung having a girls' night out on Bessie, with the Doctor, Brigadier, and Ansling being left at the Brigadier's house to do some housework, which was quite funny. And I said before, it was a very good scene that pretty much stressed how important the women are compared to the men. So onto the performances, which are brilliant. A little over the top, but with the hammy, but it was all right. Sylvester McCoy was quite good, and I think his performance in Battlefield was quite underrated. And the Seventh Doctor's character is starting to take a darker turn, which is evident because he has a change of clothes and he's not wearing the cream blazer anymore. It's now like a darker. He's now wearing a darker, like a dark brown blazer over it, but he still has the plaid trousers and the question mark pullover. And I honestly prefer this variant because I do have a slight bias for darker outfits. The Doctor is mistaken for being Merlin by the likes of Anselin, Morgaine, and Mordred, and they actually refer to him as Merlin throughout the entire story. And I liked it as if because it pretty much gave a hint to the Doctor's past and it added more mystery to the Doctor. But it's also strongly hinted that the Doctor's previous encounter with, what should I say, Morgaine's previous encounter with the Doctor was in the Doctor's future, and so it's very timey-wimey again. And the Doctor's manipulation is blatantly obvious in the story, as he actually hypnotizes Peter Wormsley and Pat the pub owner to evacuate, even though it was done for their safety. But the Doctor did it in a way that seemed very mastermindy and pretty much indicates that the Doctor's darker side is starting to emerge, and there is a slight possibility that the Doctor might enjoy manipulating other people to his own personal gain. Although we do see the Doctor being a bit silly here, which was quite fun, especially with him jumping all over the place when that snake thing was attacking him in part two, obviously, which was thanks to Sylvester McCoy's physical comedy. Yeah, and of course, I think at one point he actually pranks Brigadier Bambera and Anselin by when I think they were like sleeping together. Not in that sense, but in the sense of that like maybe like a small cozy nap. And I think small cozy nap, and the Doctor decides to get a bag and just blow some air to and pops it. Right. And then he also does chew the scenery quite a fair bit when, especially in part four, I think it was, when he was literally yelling, "There will be no battle here!" And I think Sylvester McCoy is I think out of all the Doctors, I think he handles the hammy aspects a lot better than the other Doctors, which is just quite impressive to say the least. And what's even epic is that the Brigadier actually does join in on the ham. And speaking of which, I really like the chemistry McCoy and Nicholas Courtney had. It really helped with the story, and it does emphasize how much the Doctor mean to the Brigadier and vice versa, especially when the Doctor found the Brig dazed after the blast which killed the destroyer, and said that the Brigadier was actually meant to have died in bed, after thinking that he had died. And the Reading River song, the story that aired in the Matt Smith era 22 years after Battlefield had aired, actually does have a scene where the Doctor was informed of the Brigadier's passing, which he actually passed away in bed, and that which made this scene a lot more touching. Sophie Aldred is brilliant as always, and I like how Ace does a lot here, especially with the story's comedy and a lot of them when the story's more serious elements, especially with Ace telling her special friend of the week, Shoryung, how she blew up the art room, and the last Ace was telling the story. It was juxtaposed with the knight who turned out to be Ansling getting launched into the air thanks to a grenade and into the microbrewery shot of the B&B, which was quite funny. She does also have some very serious moments that is handled quite well, and mentions how Ace probably thinks that her parents dislike her, courtesy of her and Young falling under the influence of the magic chalk circle's mind games, and this is the first indication slash reference that Ace does have a very big issue with her parents, or more so her mother, which was explained in The Curse of Fenric. Okay, and this does actually play a major part to her storyline, and especially her storyline in this season as well. And it does show, and I like how Ace was very fiercely protective over the Doctor, which was actually quite nice to see when she pretty much was literally about to throw hands at the Brigadier when he knocked out the Doctor. So he was about when he was going to confront the Destroyer himself, and that was a very good scene. And then obviously, I think the Ace obviously respected the Brigadier, but then obviously Ace being a teenager, there is some rough edges, and maybe, and I said her having some a little issues with some authority figures, especially with someone like the Brigadier. Nicholas Courtney was amazing. I do have to say that Battlefield is one of his best performances, the Brigadier, and I'll explain why in a bit. And obviously, since we last saw the Brigadier in the Five Doctors and Mordred Undead, the Brigadier has retired from being a school teacher, and he's pretty much enjoying the quiet, retired life with his wife Doris. He's been summoned to investigate the strange happenings in terms of the nuclear convoy. They were thinking it's in London, but then the helicopter actually crashes in Carbury. He meets and immediately recognizes the Doctor in the spaceship, and he helps out in a very major way and has a face-to-face confrontation with Morgaine. And Morgaine recognizes the Brigadier being a man of war and is very wary of him. And the Brigadier is amazing in the story, and he's one of the reason why I think that Battlefield is one of Courtney's best performances, because I love how he's very hands-on with the plot, and I love how Nicholas Courtney actually handles it himself, and I like how the Brigadier, who is very much used to any wrongdoings or whatnot going on with Earth, thanks to his experience with the Doctor when he was in unit. Well, they were both in unit, so to say, and now he's pretty much taking it all in stride and is more prepared for any alien attack, and is actually saying that he has golden bullets for Cybermen in the case they do show up on Earth, and is prepared to take on the Daleks whenever it needs be. And obviously, the Brigadier actually takes on and kills the Destroyer himself with the single bullet. And Nicholas Courtney actually decided to return to Doctor in this story because he noticed that the BBC was starting to lose confidence in Doctor Who, and he knew that an end was inevitable. And as I said before, the Brigadier does some very badass things like threatening Mordred and killing the Destroyer after the Destroyer actually mugged the Brigadier, and the Brigadier responded in the most human way possible, any badass human way as possible, because the Brigadier was being taunted by the Destroyer, saying, "Is this the best of Earth's champion?" He said, "I know, but then this is we just do as I can." And then he actually ends up shooting the Destroyer, and then he ends up dying. And it just goes to show how brave the Brigadier is, and obviously how prepared the Brigadier is. And despite his differences with the Doctor and during the unit days, but it is pretty obvious that we're preparing unit for something extra. He did actually learn a lot from the Doctor. And I do really like how the Brigadier even notices that he's way too old to be keeping up with the Doctor's antics and prefers the quiet life, and that makes a lot of sense too. And the Brigadier was actually meant to have died when he killed the Destroyer, and he was actually and I think Ben Aronovich was actually given the go-ahead by John Nathan Turner and Andrew Cartmel, but Ben Aronovich couldn't actually bring himself to kill the Brigadier off, and I think that was a good call. And this did actually happen before, because I think the Brigadier was meant to have died in Terror of the Zygons, but it never actually went through because because Hinchcliffe didn't want to kill off a very important character. The sidecasts, and they're all pretty damn good. First off, we have Doris. She's the Brigadier's beloved wife, and this is the same Doris that was mentioned to have given him a watch in Planet of the Spiders. She doesn't actually do anything for the story, but was because she was in the home of the Brigadier was away, and at the end, her and the girls go off on the girls' night out with on Bessie. Then we have Brigadier Winifred Bambera. She is the Brigadier of Unit, even though she knew nothing about the Doctor, but she was told about who he was eventually. Bambera started to trust the Doctor, and she had a bit of a romance with Anselin, and they battled Morgaine's Knights together. She was a great character, and the name Winifred is the German derivative of Guinevere, and I imagine she would have become a recurring character if Doctor Who had continued past season 26, especially if Unit was going to be used in some way, shape, or form. Then we have Anselin. He was the Knight Commander under King Arthur. An explosion saw him ending up inside the microbrewery, where he recognized the Doctor as Merlin. He falls for Bambera, and the two become a battle couple, and he even tried to save her from Mordred when he held her captive in part 4. He was a good character, even though he was a numpty, but he was a funny numpty. And as I said before, the expanded media actually mentions that the two actually ended up getting married shortly after the events of Battlefield. And then we have Peter Wormsley. He was the site manager of the Battlefield excavation dig, and actually takes the Doctor and Ace to the dig site. He'd spent years actually excavating the site, and he mentioned that even the littlest aspect would take up to a year to actually examine. And he found a scabbard which he gave to Pat and Liz. He was evacuated along with the others under the impending threat of the destroyer. He's very hesitant to leave, but the Doctor hypnotizes him to leave. Then we have Pat and Liz Rowlingson, a couple that ran the B&B. Pat brewed his own beer, which was apparently not very nice, and his wife Liz was blind, and it seemed as if she had some sort of foresight or somewhat. But her sight was restored by Morgaine, and they were also evacuated. And Pat was also hesitant to leave, but he was hypnotized by the Doctor as well. And I assume Morgaine cured Liz's blindness because, I'm sure it was a way of repaying them for Mordred pretty much drinking the bar dry. And then we have Sho Young. She was a Carberry local, and she assisted Wormsley in the excavations, and she bonded with Ace because she likes explosives. And the Brigadier actually hijacked her car so he can go to the dig and try and find the Doctor. She was able to evade the evacuation attempt, and she stayed behind with Ace to guard Excalibur. But the two fell under the influence of the mind games of the magic circle's influence, and she made some personal digs towards Ace and vice versa. She was a really good character, but I think it would have been interesting if she was fleshed out a little bit more. Then we have Lavelle. She was a flight lieutenant and piloted the helicopter of the Brigadier. The chopper crashed, but I think she was injured, but not too badly injured. But she encountered Morgaine in the Airbnb, but she ended up having her memories taken, and she was later killed by Morgaine. And then we have the enemies. First was Mordred. He was Morgaine's son. Although he was fairly competent in combat, but he still relied on Morgaine's magic and also recognized the Doctor as Merlin. He was stunned when his mother allowed the Brigadier to kill Mordred, but he doesn't go through it because their bluff was called. And at the end, he and Morgaine were captured by Unit troops and were taken hostage as well. He was fairly alright, but he didn't really stand out in my eyes. Then we have the main big bad, Morgaine. She was the evil sorceress who battled King Arthur and Merlin. She was very ruthless and was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone for her own gain, even her own son Mordred. But she still had honor, and she gave a bollocking to Mordred when he and his army of knights were doing battle near a war memorial, and they all decided to pay tribute to those that had fallen. Her and Mordred came to Carberry thanks to a meeting point, and then she didn't want the Doctor getting his hands on Excalibur, and she also saw the Doctor as Merlin. And she summoned the Destroyer to try and help out as well, but after the Brigadier destroyed the Destroyer, she wanted to create a nuclear holocaust, but the Doctor chastised her for resorting to that way and gave her a speech on what would have happened if she actually created a nuclear war, and she realized this and eventually surrendered. And I liked how dastardly Morgaine was, and Jean Marsh played her really well. Well, even though she didn't do a great deal, but she saved the Morgaine character with her acting. And of course, this is Jean Marsh's third time appearing in Doctor Who, and her previous times was back in the William Hartnell era. The first time she played Joanna in The Crusades, and the second time she played one story companion Sarah Kingdom. And what's even funny is that Sarah Kingdom was actually the sister of Brett Vian, who Nicholas Courtney actually portrayed. And so seeing those two interact in the story was actually quite funny. And the second, the fairly minor big bad was a destroyer. He's supposed to be a demon from hell or something, and he was capable of destroying Earth, but he was chained by Morgaine because he would have gained his full powers if he was free from his chains, and this eventually does happen. And the only thing he destroys was the B&B. But he was killed by the Brigadier with the silver bullets in a very memorable scene. The Destroyer was scary and he had a great concept, and I liked how he was a big threat, but he was disposed of very quickly. The original idea was for the Destroyer to transform from a human to demon by removing his chains, but it was too complex to do, and he's played by Marek Anton, who we do see in human form in a couple of stories' time. So the faults of Battlefield, I think one of the faults was the music score, which was keyboard synth. I liked it, but then for this story, it wasn't really suitable for Battlefield. Though it was alright in some scenes, but then it was actually used in the battle scene in part 4, which was just very cheesy and just made things a bit weird. I'd have preferred if they went for like an orchestral sort of music to it, but instead of using synth all the time. But I didn't really like how the Doctor was made a bit stupid in part 4 for the sake of the plot, but this is when he got sucker punched by the Brigadier, so even though it was for the Brigadier to actually go and confront the Destroyer, but I didn't really like how they used that, because the Brigadier had to use a simple distraction method by seeing the Doctor that there's a spaceship behind him, and I didn't really like that. And I think the Destroyer got disposed of fairly quickly, and it was a shame as well, because I think I would have liked to have a scene with him killing Morgaine and Mordred. Then he would have pretty much become the main villain of part 4, and I think they would have liked to have seen a scene with Morgaine's soldiers and King Arthur's soldiers pretty much coming together to battle and destroy the Destroyer, even though something was similarly done in the Curse of Fenric, but having it done in the story would have been a very good piece of foreshadowing to the overall plot of this season and the Cartmore Master Plan overall. So Battlefield is the last time we see the Brigadier in Doctor Who, even though he does appear in some Big Finish stories. And he actually does return in the Sarah Jane Adventures. But this was his last ever televised appearance as the Brigadier at the end of Series 2, which was in 2008. And Nicholas Courtney sadly passed away in 2011, and the Brigadier definitely does deserve to be considered one of the best Doctor Who characters ever. Though I don't consider him a companion, though I do see him as being the best of the Doctor's allies, even though the Brigadier was very difficult at times because he failed to understand what was going on, but he was able to put two and two together and figured out what was causing the threat and helped the Doctor any way he can, which the Doctor always admired. And he even actually, in this story, it was revealed that the Brigadier had actually prepped units for any major threats, like having gold bullets for the Cybermen, or having efficient snipers for the Daleks when they're aiming for the Eye Stalk, and obviously the Brigadier is without a doubt an amazing character and an icon for Doctor Who. So to conclude, Battlefield kicks off the last season of the classical in a spectacular fashion, featuring the return of the much beloved Brigadier and the retelling of the legend of King Arthur in Doctor Who style. Battlefield does unintentionally provide a glimpse of what Doctor Who would be like after its 2005 return in terms of diversity and a bit more emphasis of women and having more women featured in the battlefield. So I give Battlefield a 9 out of 10. So my next review will be Ghostlight, a story that's known for being very confusing, but I will do my very best to dissect the plot. So thanks for watching. Please let me know what you think of Battlefield and this review. Please subscribe to this channel if you haven't done so already. Until then, see you later.